Well, worse than resistant. I mean, he actually believed that biography as a genre was fraudulent. So that, and this is why, and I say this in the book, he was very keen to actually waylay the possibility of anybody writing biographies by burning a lot of early letters and papers and so on. So he was against biographers and against biography. But I think it was also a way of making claims for psychoanalysis, which of course deals in biographical knowledge, truth, information, but in a quite different way. So I think Freud is both genuinely distrustful of biography and the way it fixes people in a story about themselves, also uses biography as a negative ideal, what he wants psychoanalysis to not be. One of the things that interested me about writing this biography is that the Jews of Freud's generation, of course not only Freud's generation, were very, very keen to assimilate to their host cultures. And it seemed to me there was clearly a link between that and what goes on in a psychoanalysis, in which the analyst is both helping the patient to adapt to their culture, but also taking seriously the parts of the patient that either can't adapt or don't want to adapt. So it's a kind of assimilation and non-assimilation at the same time. A very useful project for a Jew of Freud's generation to be involved in. One of the things that occurred to me, the more actual research I did into precisely this question of Jews in Middle Europe, was how much, in a way, what Freud was describing in psychoanalytic theory was an account of what it felt like to be an immigrant. That is to say, you don't know what's going on, you don't understand the forces you're subject to, there are often false notes and mistakes and errors and unintelligibility. All those experiences that Freud describes modern people as feeling are also very much the feelings of an immigrant. And of course, this was a time when there were more and more immigrants. So it occurred to me in a way that psychoanalysis, whatever else it was an account of what it was to be an immigrant, and by the same token, how one might manage that experience. So it felt to me in some ways even more pertinent now than it might have been then. There are a number of things that, as I'm sure you've noticed, are deliberately avoided in the book. One is the fin de siècle Vienna story. The other is the what was Freud's sex life like story, which includes did he have an affair with his wife's sister? And also the question of did he believe in child sexual abuse or not? There were certain things that I think are both cliched and of limited interest, actually, that I wanted to avoid in the biography, but deliberately. In other words, I wanted to flag up that's what I was doing. Psychoanalysis comes out of two things. One is Freud's, as it were, verbal intercourse with his patients, and then the writing, the representation as writing, what he makes of it through the writing. And it seems to me Freud is a writer who is, in the best sense, making it up as he goes along. Through the initial constraints of science that he consents to, I think he uses these as a container, if you like, for a much wilder imagination. I try and say this in the book, that I think Freud needs science to set limits to his artistry, so to speak. It's not incidental that Freud as a boy loved languages, nor indeed that he did some translation, both of Charcot and of John Stuart Mill. So I think language and moving between languages is integral to Freud as a then contemporary man, but also, of course, to his transgenerational history, where Jews were moving through Europe, learning languages and holding on to their languages at the same time, all the time having to translate themselves, so to speak, both literally and metaphorically. So I think it's a central analogy for Freud about how to live as a contemporary person. Endless translation. Well, I'm personally not interested in anecdotes very much as a currency. And I think, in a way, what psychoanalysis frees you or enables you to see is the way in which people use anecdote or storytelling as a very defensive project. That is to say, to hold you at arm's length, to preempt certain kinds of conversation. Well, I think Freud is onto that. And I'm glad he was onto that, because that freed me to be onto it, if you see what I mean, and loads of other people. So that I think the anecdote is in a way the object of criticism here. It's the very thing one might be suspicious of in somebody's self-presentation. Not suspicious in a sort of malign, undermining way, but wondering what somebody's using anecdotes to do. Now, I think that's the kind of question that psychoanalysis frees you to ask. Yes, I think it did. I think it would have to, and I'm not sure I can entirely discern it. But I certainly found him more impressive in a way. What I want to believe about Freud is that he was a very ordinary, middle-class, ambitious-ish Jewish man who happened to have some very extraordinary, not ideas actually, who happened to write some very extraordinary sentences. And I think that's true. I also think that he was, broadly speaking, a kind, good-natured person and amusing, and not overly virtuous. So he seems to me to be appealing, not quite as the Jewish version of Darwin, so to speak, of the English Darwin, but certainly as a version of a Jewish man who is capable of being, in the best sense, a respectable bourgeois, not at the cost of his imagination.